heavy. Conflict, fights, quarrels. But lucky for us, that doesn't happen in the church, right? Yeah, we don't. So check the box. It's awesome, right? I mean, let's be honest. The church is a place where we love each other. We give hugs to one another all the time, and we're all good, right? It's a big love fest. So this is not an applicable passage today. Sadly, I hope you sense the sarcasm in my voice, because that's riddled with sarcasm. Sadly, that's not the case. James knows it. That's why he says what he says. That's why we have to look at this today. I don't want to do it. I'm really conflict averse. I don't like conflict. But James says they're there. Remember, he's writing to people in the church. And he says conflict is there. What are you going to do about it? Well, first, before you can do something about it, you got to know where it comes from. You got to know what it is. Conflict, judgment, quarrels. They're all around us. And James wants to tackle it today. And he does it in one of the coolest, most beautiful ways. By pointing us not just to a solution, but to a Savior. But I'll get there in a little bit. First, I got to do something here that I've been lamenting to do for a while. But when I opened this series about the book of James, the very first week I said that this book, more than most any other book in the Bible, really rubs people the wrong way. It really bothers people who read this book. Because when people read the book, what they hear is condemnation of themselves. What they hear, we just look at the passage. He says, you sinners, you adulterous people. And he's writing to the church. So naturally, when you read this book, when you study the book of James, there's going to be a little bit of you that feels indicted. It's not of any coincidence that this book, and going through this the last many weeks, has incited the most quarrels that I've had with people over a while. People saying, I don't like this part. I don't like that you said this. I don't like this. I don't like this. And okay, I'll take it. I'm always open for criticism. But let me posit two things. If the book of James, when you read it, bothers you, or bothers me, maybe there's a good reason for that. First. But if you read the book of James and it bothers you because it sounds like he's constantly bringing the hammer down on you and saying, do this, go help the orphans and the widows and those in need. Don't talk bad to people. Be wise in relationships. Don't fight. If you sound or if you think that James is always just bringing the hammer down, then you're missing something that James is trying to communicate. James does not say, be a good person. He doesn't try to guilt you into action. He wants action. He wants us as the church, as Christians, to do something about our faith. But he doesn't implore guilt for it. And he doesn't just merely exhort you. He doesn't just say, do this and wag his finger. Here's my proof. And you got to know this before I get in what I'm going to talk about today. You got to hear this. So if you zone out during the sermon, fine, that's okay. Stay with me right now for a couple minutes and come back to me when I get to Jesus. Okay, that's all I want. But here's what he's doing. He's not guilting. Remember, back a few weeks ago, he says it's like somebody who looks in a mirror, sees who they are, but then walks away and they forget. I heard a pastor who's a really tall pastor say that when he looks in a mirror and he walks away, sometimes he forgets how tall he is and he hits his head because he forgets to duck sometimes. He was like 6'5". And he says, what that means is I'm not seeing myself correctly. James is imploring you not just in action, but rather to say, know who you are in Christ first. Look into the mirror. He says, look into the law, look into the Bible, read it, get in a relationship. It's not just rules. It's a relationship. And James says, you will never, ever do anything in this book. You'll always be fighting with each other, we'll look at it. You'll always be warring. You'll always be saying, me, mine, until you and me first look into our hearts and realize who we are. And you want to know who we are? James says it. He says, actually, in the English translation, it says, you adulterous people. Oh, that sounds really heavy, doesn't it? And I've heard actually sermons about this passage, which means the people say that what James is talking about is sexual sin in the church. Some of your translations say lust. I read Passions today. And there's been a fair amount of people who read this and say, well, James, what he's doing is talking about passions, lust. He says adulterous, so he must be talking about sexual sin. Oh, you miss his point. There is sexual sin in the church, we're not going to lie, but that's not what he's primarily talking about. When he says you adulterous people, what he's trying to say is, don't you realize who you are in relationship to God? He's giving you a metaphor. He's giving you a marriage. He's saying this is a God who wants to be intimate with you. And when you don't do what he says in his word, or if you don't go talk to him enough, you're not just breaking rules, you're breaking his heart. That's what it means to be adulterous. And in the Greek translation, it actually says adulterers and adulteresses. It's not just talking about sexual sin. It's talking about people who look at the marriage relationship that they have with Jesus, with God, and yet they turn their back on him. See, James, what he's trying to do to motivate you and me into action. Yes, we should go care for the widows and the orphans. The sermon's on YouTube. Go look at it. I did it a couple weeks ago. We should. And we should watch our tongues and what we say and how we treat people. Those are all valid points, but you'll never do it. You'll always be thinking James is bringing the hammer down, or the pastor's bringing the hammer down on you, until you realize God's in a love relationship with you. He's in a marriage. And like any marriage, you can't just spend 5 minutes a week with them. It won't work. He says, you adulterous people, as a way to say, look, you haven't just broken his rules, you've broken his heart. Know who you are. You're the spouse of him. That's awesome. That's juicy, that's powerful, that's weighty, that's glorious. But until you and I start to realize that we've been brought back into this relationship, and God says, I continually want, and I'll continually come and get you. I'll run after you, even when you run away from me. Then you see that it's a relationship that James is talking about. He wants us to have conviction of our faith that spreads into action of our faith, because we know now who we are: saved, loved, cherished, run after. There's a lot of metaphors that are used about God and his relationship to us in the Bible. And they're all really good metaphors, and they're all good to focus on at certain times. There's the relationship of a king, in that we should obey him. There's the metaphor of him as a shepherd, that we should be guided by him. But what James is saying is, look, people, this is a marriage, a union, intimacy, and that's what he wants from you. Not just obedience, compassion. And throughout the Bible, what you can see, if you read the Bible, is that God is always doing this with his people. They turn, he runs. They walk away, he runs even faster to them. And there's a great story of this in the Bible before I go on that I want to touch on. I have to press this out today. This idea of adultery with God. Because there's a great story, and it's one of my favorite stories of the entire Bible. And if you have a chance, go back and read the book of Hosea. It's a small book and a simple book. And essentially it's this: God comes to Hosea and he says, I want you to work for me. You're going to be my prophet. You're going to do things for me. Isn't that cool? Hosea's okay, cool. But he says, in order for you to do things for me, you need to have a relationship that when you know my relationship to my people. So he says, Hosea, go marry somebody. And never one day in her life will she ever be faithful to you. And he says, then you'll know what I've gone through. There's a part in Hosea chapter 4 where he says, my people do not know me. He says, Hosea, before you can do anything, you're going to have to see and feel the pain that I felt of people turning and they don't know me and they run away. And throughout the story, if you read the book of Hosea, his wife is unfaithful. And he has to go to her, and there's a place where he has to go into the center of town, into the marketplace, the place of shame, where all of his friends would have known what his wife has done. And all of his friends would have sat around him and said, oh, Hosea, there she's at it again. Stupid Hosea. But he goes into the marketplace, and he buys her back. And God says, now you know what I do for my people. James says, you adulterous people. He's not bringing the hammer down, folks. What he's saying is you and me are united in intimacy with a God who wants that from us. So then, therefore, do what he says now. That was a rather long-winded intro. Don't worry, you still get out of here on time today. I'm respectful of your time. But we got to talk about this thing, conflicts, quarrels in the church. Remember, James is talking to Christians. He's not talking to people outside the church necessarily. He's writing to a group of Christians. He's writing to devout, Bible-believing, devout Christians who go to church probably every week. And yet he's saying, what causes conflicts among you? And what are you going to do about it? I didn't give you an outline today, so you can take notes if you want. But James touches on two really important issues in the church, conflict and judgment. Oh, and they happen all the time, don't they? And some of you have been in church experiences where you've been really burned by judgment and conflict. But what I'm going to call it today is conflict, judgment, and grace that James gives us. First, let's look into this. Conflict is the first heading. There's conflict, but why? Why can't we all just get along? James gives you the answer. In verse 1 and verse 4, he repeats himself. And James doesn't really repeat himself. Remember, I told you before, he's a rather smart, cheeky writer. He's incredibly gifted in Greek language. He would not repeat himself unless he was trying to hammer home a point. And the word he uses in verse 1 and 4 translates in some of your translations as lust or passion. And many of you, I know, read the Bible in other languages, so I don't know how exactly it's translated. Which is why I always go back to the Greek. It's not to show off my Greek knowledge to you, because I really don't have any. I just look it up online, Google. I studied Greek at seminary, but it's, this is a steel trap of cartoons in here. One thing goes in, Greek goes in one ear, comes out the other. So I don't know Greek. I'm not trying to show off here about my knowledge of Greek, but you have to go back to it. Because passions and lust is a horrible, horrible, horrible translation of this term. And you'll never know what causes what conflicts unless you know this word. And it's a word that's used all throughout the New Testament. And it's a big word, but it's a cool word. And it's a word rich and dripping with meaning, and you got to know it. He says, what causes fights among you and among me? It's this word called epithumia. And I've talked about it a few times, many times actually, in the times that I've preached here. So perhaps you've heard me say this before. Indulge me, though. He says epithumia is causing conflict. So what is that? What is epithumia? Well, maybe you can guess from the beginning of the word, EPI, is where we get words like epicenter, epic. Epithumia isn't just lust. It isn't just sexual sins. It's not that at all. Epithumia, every time it's used in the New Testament, it better would be translated over desire. That's a funny phrase, and we don't have that. I don't think we have that word. Over desire, epidesire, EPI, it's at the center. What he means is this. There's desires that you have in your heart that are good. Love, family, success, comfort, approval, affirmation, respect. These are all good desires that you and I share in our hearts. But what James says causes conflicts is when those thumia become epithumia, meaning that the desire has taken you over. You can't live without it. You need it. And you'll put it at the center of your heart. If it's the respect of other people that you seek and it becomes an over desire, the minute that you don't get respect from other people, you'll be cut to the core. You'll be damaged, hurt. See, it's not really about the respect. It's about you put the respect at a higher place than it should be. He says, this is what you're doing in the church. We all do this. We take one thing that's a good thing, but we make it the ultimate thing and put it above God. And when we start to do that, spare the one who comes to hurt that thing, because we will hurt them in return. This is not just lust. It's not just passions. It's when desires become over desires. And when that happens, what happens to us in conflict? He says it. Why are there quarrels? Why is there selfish envy? You know what that means, what he's saying? He's saying, in the church, you want to win. I want to win. It turns into relationships, very much turn into zero-sum game. I win, you lose, or you win and I lose. And James says, it's not to be so. What's causing the conflict is that you and I take one thing, or many things, and we put it above God. And that's the thing that starts to rule us. And that's the thing that starts to control us. And that's the thing that starts to govern. And if somebody comes along and ticks at it, or picks at it, or scabs at it, or whatever, Fists are up. We constantly go around in our lives, do we not? Wanting to be right, wanting to be approved. And if we make that the center of our heart, James argues, if that's your epithemia, if that's your over-desire, whatever it may be, search it out. There's something in your heart and in my heart that we constantly put above God. And when we do that, we will war with each other. We will fight and we will claw. Why? So we want to be right. We want to be justified. Let me illustrate this. Epithemia, what do I mean by that? Sounds fancy and good. Let me give an illustration. And before I do this, let me caveat. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to talk about my kids again. And I do that quite frequently here from the pulpit, and I realize that most of the illustrations I give about my 5-year-old and my 3-year-old are rather negative. I love my kids. Okay? There's my disclaimer. They're good kids. So even if I say things up here that don't sound so great, I love them. They're almost the epithemia of my life at times. So I love them. They're great kids. But here, let me illustrate what this means, an over-desire. My kids, as most kids are wont to do, at a young age, fight. They quarrel. They war. And I've noticed that because I work at home, with my office door closed, that I'll hear a blood-curdling scream from time to time. So I have to leave my office and go out into the living room to find out what is causing such screaming amongst you. What causes conflicts and quarrels among you, I ask them. Almost 9 out of 10 times. No, let's go 10 out of 10. They're fighting over one toy. I know you've been there, parents. Now, the absurdity of it, there's a lot of it, absurdity. The absurdity of it is that my house is filled with probably hundreds of toys. And the other absurdity about it is that the toy most often that they're fighting on is the one that's either broken, ripped, or damaged in some way. It's a stupid toy. They have other options. But they war. Why? Well, my 5-year-old says, no, it's mine. My 3-year-old says, no, it's mine. It's a lame toy. They're not fighting over the toy because it never was about the toy. It's about one being right and the other being wrong. One winning and the other one losing. Lots of other toys, but that one has become their epithemia. They have an over-desire to be proven right. Here's how Luke Timothy Johnson, a commentator on this book of James, puts it. Listen to these words. When James says, what is the world, that you're friends with the world, and Luke Timothy Johnson is a very astute commentator, and this is what he answers to that question and to this issue of conflict in the church. He says this, and what for James is the measure of the world? It is defined precisely in terms of the logic of envy. Human existence is a zero-sum game in a universe of limited resources, a closed system. Being and worth are dependent on having. Having more means being more, and having less means being less. Therefore, by this logic, humans are essentially in competition with one another for being and worth. And the surest way to succeed is to eliminate the competition, other people. But he goes on and he closes this section. He mentions the part in James 2 when James says Abraham was a friend of God, if you remember that a few weeks ago. And he says, Abraham is the friend of God, quote unquote, by the offering of his son Isaac. Abraham showed himself to be a friend of God. Why? Because he accepted God's way of viewing reality rather than the world's. By the world's measure, he should have clung to his son in order to ensure the blessing that was promised to him. But Abraham did not view the world as a closed system. He saw reality as one constantly gifted by the giver of every good and perfect gift, and was willing to give back one gift to the one who gives a greater gift. See, what he's saying is this. Essentially, as human beings, we operate in the world as if it's a closed system. I win, you lose. I gain, you lost. I'm right, you're wrong. That's conflict. The need to be right, the need to be justified, the need to know that everyone loves you and you're the one that everybody wants to be around and nobody wants that other person and they're completely wrong. Get rid of them. I cut them off. James says that's what causes conflict. Not just little passions, but over desires, where things come into our hearts, good things, that we make into ultimate things. Now, I spent the majority of time on that, and I'm going to close by saying this. I said conflict and judgment, because James talks about them both. And he talks about judgment, and he says in verse 11, you look back at your passage, and he says, you judge, you judge, you judge, you judge. But he says, then there's one judge. I'll get to that in a second. It's another really cool word. He uses two different words, though. He says, you judge, and he uses one type of word in Greek. And then he says, but there's one judge, and it's another word. And I'll explain what I mean by that. What he's essentially saying is this. You and I are going to tend to go around judging other people, saying, you're wrong. Let me tell you how to fix your life. Come over here, I got some advice for you. And he says, listen, you're going to always do that. This word for judge that he uses almost as I'll call it little judges, like little mini judges. That's us. Every day, every week, especially on Sundays. We're going to always be prone to go around and tell everyone else what's wrong with their life, James argues. He says, you judge and you judge and you judge, but there's only one real judge. Who's that? Hold on. And in judging, what you're doing is you're giving somebody all truth, but no love. You're telling them, here's all the truth about your life, wagging my finger, but no love. Or you could be the type of person, on the other hand, who says, I just love everybody. Everybody's good. I'm good. You're good. We're all okay. That's all love, no truth. If you give only somebody truth but no love, that you're judging and condemning. But if you give them only love without truth, you're not helping them at all. You're just enabling them to be who they are. There has to be a balance. There has to be a perfect balance. And James tells us what it is. In verse 12, James says, but there's only one lawgiver. And this word that he uses is only used one time in all the Bible this way. Used in a slightly varying form in another part of the Bible, talking about someone. He says there's one lawgiver. Who it is? I'll give you a hint. Begins with J, ends with S. What do I mean by that? Who was the only one who could perfectly combine truth and love, grace, mercy, justice? Him. On the cross. That's the gospel. It says this, here's the truth about your life. You are a sinner, broken, lost, confused, feeble, petty, judgmental, warring, conflicting. But here's the love. He died for you. So you only get the perfect balance of truth and love in the gospel. You won't get it anywhere else. Religion tells you they're all truth. You're bad. You're a sinner. Do this. Fix your life. Get it in order. Modern secular ideology will tell you, no, you're okay. I'm okay. Hug it up. On the cross, Jesus puts together truth and love in a way that's never been done in the course of human history. Now, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, this word for lawgiver is translated in another way called enacted. Let me read it to you. Very, very rare word, but you got to know who the lawgiver is, who gives truth and love at the same time in bleeding mercy. Here he is. Hebrews 8 says, but it is as it is. Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted, there's that word, on better promises. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities and remember their sins no more. I will be merciful to their iniquities and remember their sins no more. What causes conflicts among you and me, brothers and sisters, is because all we do is remember the sins of others. All we do is hold on to their iniquities. and tell them about it every chance we get. All truth, no love. But he says, look what's been enacted. It's better. It's more beautiful. There was a lawgiver who came down. And in his law, he had every right to stamp you and me out. You want to talk about bringing the hammer down? He had every right to do it. But he says, put the hammer on me. Bring it down. I'll take it. The gospel says we are wrongdoers who war and quarrel and fight. We're like children fighting over a lame toy when treasures await. Because he died for you and for me. How then can we hold on to the sins of others? How long and how possibly could we hold on to what other people do against us? When we see that every sin was done against him first. All your iniquities and all mine are stamped on that cross forevermore. He remembers them not. And one of the greatest lines in that Hebrews passage that I just read, he says, and they will be my people and I will be their God. You know what he's doing? The exact opposite of that book of Hosea. Remember in Hosea, he says, my people don't know me. They turn. They run towards other lovers, other desires, other over desires. And he says, but I'll go to the marketplace and I will buy them back all the time. You want to know what the ultimate marketplace of shame was? It was on that hill when he took it and he died for you. And people spit on him and they laughed at him and they mocked him. What was he doing on the cross? He was buying you back. He was buying me back with his life, not some shekels like Hosea did, but with his blood. Now, I ask again, what causes conflicts among us? What causes wars? What causes quarrels? What causes you to me and go around and be the little judges? When we see that the big judge looks at us, he says, I remember them no more, those sins. Come on in. It's a marriage. It's love. Poured out for you. There's only one lawgiver. And he's already passed judgment. How can we do that to others? Go in silent prayer now and reflect on this before we go to take the Lord's Supper today.